Welcome back. We're still thinking about Hebrew poetry. You know, as in any language, I suppose, while it's certainly not limited to poetry, poetry makes a far greater use of figurative, symbolic language. And along this line, a feature of Hebrew poetry that may elude the English reader is the oral, verbal wordplay. You recognize, for example, that a pun in one language may be next to impossible to replicate in another language. But the Hebrew poets love to play with sounds. So, for example, Yahweh asked Jeremiah, what do you see? And Jeremiah looks and he replies that he sees a budding almond tree, a shaked. And Yahweh replies, right on. I'm shokading my word to perform it. Shaked, shokade. Do you hear the repeated sounds, the pun? Or Micah's puns in chapter 1. Bagat al tagidu, bako al teveu, bevet al afra afar. Tell it not in Gath, weep not at all. In Beit La'afra, that is the house of dust, roll yourself in the dust. It's sort of like, it just doesn't come across in English, the puns, but it would, if it did, it'd be something like, tell it not in Tellington, wail not in wailing. Dust manner will roll in the dust. They love their puns. Isaiah 5:7 reports that Yahweh looked for mishpat, justice among his people, but he found only mishpach, infringing on the law. He looked for tzedakah, righteousness, but all he found was tzedakah, screaming for help. So, watch for the use of puns. Watch also for the use of the literary device of chiasm. The inversion or the playback of parallelism in subsequent lines. Let me give you an example. Turn your Bibles to Psalm 8. How would you characterize the first part of verse 1? Something like exaltation? Then what's verse 2 and 3 about? Okay, God's sovereign power or something like that. How about verse 4? The relative smallness of humanity. Verse 5. God's exaltation of humanity. Verses 6, 7, and 8. God's delegation of rule to humankind. And what's verse 9 about? Exaltation. Do you see the inversion pattern? Verses 1 and 9 are parallel. Verses 2 and 3 and 6 through 8 are parallel. Verse 4 and 5 are parallel. And this is what we call a chiasm from the Greek letter chi or chi. Doesn't exactly look like an X, but it's the half of the X, I guess. Anyway, chiasm is what we call it. So there you go. Well, we've been thinking about some of the features of Hebrew poetry that sets it apart from what we're used to in English poetry. I'd like to turn the page and think a bit about the deployment of poetry in the Hebrew Bible. Now, most folks who are familiar with the Bible would immediately associate the Psalms with poetry, and Proverbs and Job too, while recognizing these are thought of as wisdom literature. And well, they'd add the Song of Songs and Ecclesiastes, but many folks may not recall that we find poetry in the Torah. In the Pentateuch, I mentioned the Song of Moses in Exodus 15. In the former prophets, there's the Song of Deborah. In Judges 5, there's Hannah's prayer in 1 Samuel 2. There's David's lament for Saul and Jonathan in 2 Samuel 1. David's song of praise in 2 Samuel 22. David's last words, 2 Samuel 23. Isaiah's message to Hezekiah in 2 Kings 19. There's lots in the latter prophets. I mean, just, scan the pages of Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and the 12 minor prophets. You'll see that almost any time they're preaching, they're doing it in poetic form. So that roughly a third of the First Testament is poetry rather than prose. My take is that the Hebrew prophets preach more like Martin Luther King than like Rick Warren or Chuck Swindoll or John Piper or almost anybody else I can think of. See, the 5 books we commonly refer to as the poetic books, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Song of Songs, Ecclesiastes, are contained in the part of the Hebrew Bible called the writings. Remember, there's the Torah, the Nevi'im, the prophets, and the Ketuvim, the writings. So Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, the initials, TNK in English, creates the acronym Tanakh. But you'll be interested to know that the latter 2 books, the Song and Ecclesiastes, are 2 of the 5 Megillot, the scrolls that are designated for use in what we might think of as the church year. Each of the 5 scrolls of the Megillot is read at designated times in the liturgical calendar to this day. They're arranged in the Hebrew canon chronologically, so that Song of Songs is read at Pesach, the Shabbat at Passover in March and April. Ruth is read at Shavuot, Pentecost, in June. Lamentations at the memorial of the destruction of the temple, 9th of Av. Ecclesiastes is read at Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles in September, October, and then Esther, read in connection with the celebration of Purim in March. Well, we get back together, we'll take a look at how this works out in the Psalms. So, we'll see you in a bit.